That was great.
Thank you. Could I just update my CV? It's now 18 books, not 15. They keep multiplying. And I'm no longer with English Heritage. I served a dozen years there. And I've moved over to Historic England, which is the government watchdog for heritage. So it's the same kind of thing with a different organization.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you for that update. Well, you're quite well known to all pagan scholars and nearly every pagan in Britain, at least. And some of our viewers may not be acquainted with you, so I'd love for you to share a bit about your early years, your education, and what made you take the research path that you had.
My life was made by a glass of water. It was consumed by my father. My father was from junior branch of an old English gentry family, so he had to make his own way. And he went out to India to make money in the tea business, starting his own. And on arriving there, he borrowed a huge amount of money to start up the business, and it did well. He met and married my mother, who was from an aristocratic Russian family that had fled Russia at the revolution and gone to India. But its money had run out when my mother was around 20. So she had to make a life of her own. And in India, in those days, for someone like her, that basically meant finding a husband. And so she found my father. And everything went well. They produced me. My mother got pregnant again with a sister. And then my father stopped off for a drink on the way back home. It was that really dry season just before the monsoon winds arrived. And he was very thirsty, so he called for a large glass of water. And the bartender, being lazy, took the water out of the tap instead of out of the still. And my father died of typhoid a week later. My mother left with a business and estate which she couldn't run, and it was completely saddled with debt. It was just starting to make a profit, but she had to sell the lot just to pay off the debts incurred, and then leave India, which was growing rather hostile to Europeans, for Britain, which was a country she hardly knew. And she arrived penniless as a single mother, and so was given a house on a very, very violent and rough estate for people with no money and social problems. And that's where I grew up. She did a very good job with me. She managed to bring me up really well, but she despaired and died. Her health broke down when I was a student. And I escaped. I worked my way through the state school system. And when I was 17, I got a scholarship to Cambridge, one of the two old universities in England, and started an academic life from there. And I think you could say that one of the reasons why I became a historian is that I grew up with this complete disconnection of reality, because I was surrounded by a very economically and socially depressed and impoverished and rough community, a blue-collar community. But my mother's possessions and photograph albums were full of memories of Imperial India and Imperial Russia, and a totally different social milieu. So to make sense of my situation, I guess I had to understand history.
Wow, I'm speechless. That is fascinating. I have found, if I may share about myself, that the last few years I've finally taken a dive into more of our family genealogy, and found that in some cases I'm able to trace back to before the Common Era, and quite a few countries. Yeah. Well, if you run into anybody who was ever a Roman citizen, they keep careful records. And that sense of history has a great deal more meaning for me now. I think I understand a great deal more about social movements, about women's issues. When I see a Danish bride in, say, the 500s suddenly going to live in northern Italy, it sort of tells you, it reinforces a little bit of what we've learned about our roles in the past, for example. So I understand that you dabbled in archaeology. I don't think of you as dabbling in anything, Ronald, but tell us about your archaeology interests.
Yeah, they kicked off when my mother got a boyfriend for a while, who was an oil man working in North Africa. And he flew her over to the island of Malta, which was then a British naval base, close to the coast of North Africa, where he could vacation with her. And we spent the summer of 1965 there. Malta has a superb archaeology of its own, based on stunning New Stone Age temples, and there's a lot from other periods as well. And being inquisitive, I got to know about this. I got to know about it quite a lot, and I got to know the archaeologists who supervised and worked on the site. So when we returned to England, I set about trying to discover the same kind of thing in Britain. And of course, I then discovered huge amounts of it. Britain has a fabulous trove of prehistoric monuments from about 5 different ages. And then there's the early historic, the Roman, the Saxon, the Viking stuff. So I greedily explored it all when I was 11, 12, 13. And I joined the local archaeological group and worked with it for a number of years. In my vacations, I visited and took part in some of the great historic excavations of prehistoric monuments in the late 1960s. And I kept that connection going. That's why I write about archaeology and its history quite a lot. I've remained friends with the whole rising generation of archaeologists in Britain, who now lead the profession because we're all of that age. And I sit in the archaeology as well as the history section of the British Academy, which is the kind of Olympus of British academics.
So, yeah, I've read people comment that their book Pagan Britain was more about archaeology than history, but that is the history. It's just not a written or verbal record.
But also I'm writing the history of the archaeology. I'm writing an account of changing attitudes and beliefs about prehistory.
Oh, I can hardly wait to see that. So that's your current effort.
No, that's Pagan Britain 2013.
Oh, in that book, you're right. Okay, yeah. Okay, and of course, we've really had reckonings here in the Americas about really so-called research on Indigenous people and First Nations people. And there's been a radical change there, still changes needed. How have you, in your work and the museum and research environment there, I'm curious about the treatment of human remains. Would you like to comment on that?
There's been a huge shift in attitudes to ancient human remains in museums, and even more to more recent human remains taken from outside Britain, from indigenous peoples in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, and the dominions of the Victorian British Crown. The self-consciousness of the survivors of these peoples was given a tremendous lead and boost by Native Americans in responding to their position in the late 20th century. And it was Native America that launched the movement to repossess the human remains from their societies held in museums run by people of European descent. And that inspired peoples from the British dominions. That's a technical term for self-governing areas of the British Crown, like Canada and Australia, to ask British museums to return the remains and some of the cultural artifacts that they held from their peoples. And that in turn provoked a debate about the status of remains of ancient British people held in museums. And there are thousands and thousands of them, amassed over about 200 years. They've been treated hitherto very much like other inanimate objects. And museum staff began to feel rather queasy about this and begin to wonder what values this depersonalization of human material represented. And the result was a connection of developing attitudes in which in the last 30 years, the ancient peoples whose remains are held in museums have been recognized as having human rights. And although the scientific value of the remains is often tremendous, we can learn so much about the people from them, and so make the people more real, give them more value to us now. But they're no longer being displayed in most cases without any sense of their humanity. And where there is no value scientifically for the remains, largely because we don't know where they came from, then they're increasingly being reburied. What has not happened is that pagans in the modern British community have acquired a special role as spokespeople for and negotiators on behalf of the ancient British. They tried to do this very hard in the 2000s and 2010s, but it failed because people involved in the heritage industries and the government didn't feel able to give pagans a special status as interpreters of the ancient past. On the other hand, they became much more ready to grant the visitors' rights to hold ceremonies in the institutions concerned, so they could connect with the ancient dead. So they have acquired religious rights with regard to the ancient British, but not supervisory or interpretative rights. And I guess that's something of a victory.
Well, this is of great interest to me hearing you talk about it, because you may or may not be aware that I just returned from a trip to Egypt, my first and likely to be my only. And everywhere we went, our guide, we had a personal tour, so it was just us and our guide, and he is a professor. And he would point to this and say, you see that? You see this? All the heads are missing. He said, that's in this museum, this is in that museum, this is in that. And, great deal of resentment. And I said, we just were to the point after a few days that we were just sick to our stomachs. But I also did comment to him. On the other hand, people like me who may never get to come here get to be exposed to some things that we would not have otherwise, which, elicited a disgruntled look. But we did go in a couple of places. We thought Tut's mommy. I don't have a great interest in Tut, but if you're there, you kind of need to go to the tomb. And I just found it macabre and kind of pathetic. There was another tomb that had a fetus that had been mummified, and that was on display. And again, it was intellectually interesting, but it was emotionally somewhat disturbing. And it made me have a new awareness of how all of this might be approached.
I think Egypt's a different case because the bodies there were not supposed to be displayed. They were supposed to be bandaged up and mummified. And to unwrap them and deprive them of all the sacred objects which were wound in with them is in many ways to deconsecrate, maybe even to desecrate them. Over in Britain, it's a bit different, especially in the Neolithic and Bronze Ages and Iron Ages, the prehistory, because human bodies were treated as very much part of the living world. In Neolithic rites, the long barrows were opened up regularly, and bones were taken out of them to be used in rituals. And you find human bone all round most prehistoric living sites. the living like to have bits of their ancestors and sometimes of their enemies around them as well on display. So in our treatment of ancient British bodies, we're not departing so much from that tradition. And also, to me, I do, in view of this backdrop, this context, quite like to look my remote forebears in the eye. And I have a feeling about the bones displayed in museums that they're sacred objects, rather like the bones of saints displayed in Roman Catholic Christian churches. So I'm comfortable with them being there, provided that they're given a special place, that they're displayed in a sensitive way, that people are informed that they're going to encounter them, so that they prepare themselves as moving into a different space from the ordinary. And there I think we can interrelate with them. But I think cultural context is absolutely vital. If I went into an ethnographic museum and found myself looking at the head of a native Tasmanian displayed there as if it were a trophy, but I'd feel very uneasy indeed.
So this reinforces what I've heard before, that it's incumbent on the educational staff, and that would include people creating the displays, to interpret them in a way that is both respectful and educational, and warns visitors they're about to see a body.
Yes, precisely.
Well, and I noticed in the news just 2 days ago another article about that old chestnut of bog remains, bodies found in bogs. And I know you've had some experience with this as a historian. Would you like to comment on anything?
Well, I got involved in a debate over one particular bog body, the most famous from England and probably from Britain. It was the most sensational British archaeological find of the 1980s, and the most closely studied human body of all time until the end of the 1980s. And it's called Lindo Man. It's the upper half of a young male body found in a peat bog near the city of Manchester in 1984. What interested me about it was the interpretation that a top pathologist had decided that the man concerned, who died almost a couple of thousand years ago, had been ritually murdered or sacrificed in a hideous manner, but almost simultaneously, his skull had been fractured by a heavy blow, his neck had been broken by a strangling cord, and his jugular vein had been cut in his throat. Now, by anybody's evaluation, this is overkill. And so it was taken to be a ritual killing. And it was dated to the late Iron Age, which is the time the Druids were around. And as the Romans had accused the Druids of having a special affection for human sacrifice, this was regarded as the objective truth that Druids engaged in this. And I noticed that it became a justification for religious intolerance in the present day. Christian fundamentalists republished novels about the horrors of the ancient Druids, with new prefaces saying, if you think this is fiction, just go to the British Museum, which is our national museum, and see Lindo Man, and that's the proof. And a journalist in a top British newspaper, The Guardian, noted the connection between the ancient Druids and the modern day Druids celebrating their rituals, and said, when you go to Stonehenge and you see these innocent looking modern people in their white robes, just think of Lindo Man and know you're only a heartbeat away from horror. So Lindo Man was made a vehicle for people's anxieties about alternative religion, particularly paganism. And that's fair enough if the interpretation of Lindo Man had been correct. But when I did some investigation, I found two things. The first is that he doesn't seem to date to the Iron Age at all. He dates to the Roman period, which is when the Druids were supposed to be no longer around. And second, that when the body was freshly discovered, it had been examined by two top medical professionals. One of them was the pathologist who provided the triple killing diagnosis, but the other completely disagreed with this and said that Lindo Man had been beaten to death. His skull had been broken by one blow, his neck had been broken by another, and his rib by a third, and he had been killed by the blows to the head of the neck. That the cut over the jugular was not ancient and was probably made by somebody digging for peat centuries later. And the strangling cord around his neck was actually a necklace. That the body showed none of the signs of muscular trauma associated with strangulation. And this report had simply been binned. The more sensational one accepted for no reason that I could see. And so I queried the whole interpretation of the body. And that resulted in a debate which lasted a few years and ended in the acceptance by the museum service that my argument that Lindo Man could be interpreted in different ways was valid. He could be a human sacrifice. He could be a criminal executed for an offence which he may or may not actually have committed. He could be a murder victim of a robber gang because other bodies of the same age have now been found in the bog. So there are three different interpretations. And the British Museum revised its labelling system and removed the confident attribution of human sacrifice, ritual killing, and produced a pamphlet which invited people to make up their own minds. And so I was very pleased to have got a debate going. I ended up with an open verdict on what had been used as a means of justifying suspicion and intolerance towards alternative points of view.
The timing was probably terrible for pagans because that was the height of the satanic panic, at least in this country.
You're absolutely right. Yes. And the two made very bad partners.
Mm-hmm. And I'm struck by how resistant that it took several years to even acknowledge that there could have been various scenarios. I recently attended a seminar at the American Research Center in Egypt, or we call it ARCE, in which a fairly prominent Egyptologist presented on his opinion that Tutankhamun may well have died because of an attack by a hippo while he was out on the water. And it was so convincing and persuasive to me that I'm fairly convinced that's probably what happened. And according to this person, a certain prominent former antiquities head agreed with him for about 3 years, as did some of the additional prominent people there. This was not confidential. I'm just not going to name names here. And then eventually just said, no, we're going to stick with the story. You know, we don't know how he was killed. He might have been lame. He might not have been. And I thought, well, there are a lot of careers on the line, I suppose, or they think they are.
True, but that's almost an opposite case to Lindo Man, in that here is somebody coming along with a very plausible and well-grounded explanation, the hippo attack. And what the rest of the experts are saying is, let's accept that as one possible explanation, along with falling from his chariot, getting a wasting disease that made some of his bones collapse, and all the other explanations I've heard. So to leave it to people to make up their own minds, I think, is one of the fairest ways of dealing with the past.
Well thought. Well, speaking of the past, I think when you were here in 2013, you mentioned that your next project was to research the European archives of witch trials. And I always remember that you said you were dreading it, but you knew it had to be done. And of course, you came out with your book a few years later. And I just wonder if you'd like to share about that experience and, what personal lessons you might have derived that could be useful to others doing their own research.
Well, I learned it wasn't so bad. What I dreaded was having to deal with two particularly tacky types of primary source material. One is the records of trials of people who in many cases have clearly been tortured into surrender and confession of all sorts of awful things they've never done. And in many cases, which many of us would believe no human being could actually do in reality. And the other type of material were the handbooks and the philosophical treatises of demonologists, people who believed in the threat from demons and were urging on witch hunting and justifying it. And I thought I'd have a very depressing time devoting years of my life to an intensive study of material like that. It wasn't that bad, I stress, because I came in with particular interests, the role of folklore and of ancient ideas in the witchcraft beliefs, the beliefs about witchcraft. And the other thing was the role of animals in magic and in popular belief, and the role of fairies. And once I found that I was looking for these particular things, it made it much easier for me to proof myself against the rest of the material and its implications. And I managed to get by like that. It still wasn't my favorite research project, but it was a big book, and there were lots of things in the book that weren't dependent on witch trial records and demonologists. So I enjoyed those much more. But I managed to get through the research without the 2 or 3 years of clinical depression, which I feared might result in immersing myself in that kind of material. It was published in 2017. Then I went on to other things.
I confess I haven't read that book for the same reason. I'm not sure I want to be depressed that much. But
it's actually depressing, I can promise you.
Okay, it goes back on my list then. So, whether it has to do with the emotional impact or anything else, do you have any advice you give to young scholars, or I should say scholars? Our students are not necessarily young, but people who are entering the field, so to speak.
Well, people enter the field for quite different reasons. And my advice would be very different according to their motivation. For people who have passed through a particular career structure and are now branching out to do stuff that's always interested in them, my advice is simply enjoy it. You will get a first-class education. It will open up opportunities for you to give the world your own ideas. There is no problem there. The only difficulty is for genuinely young scholars and ambitious scholars who are pagans or are just very attracted by paganism as a subject and want to base their career on researching into it. There just aren't that many jobs in it. And there's still something of a stigma in the academic system against people who research into it. So I have 2 contradictory bits of advice. The first is follow your heart. If you really, really want to dive in and try and make a career out of it, then you'll succeed if you're really, really good. The crucial thing here is what I call vitamin P, which is publications. You can write well and you can get work accepted for publication, then you will get a job. It may not be terribly easy, and if you're writing about paganism, then it'll be more of an uphill gradient than if you're researching in more mainstream subjects and more major world religions as defined in the mid-20th century. But the other way of doing it is to try and write your thesis and make your first publications about more mainstream branches of religion and history, to write about better known religions to begin with, and to study ancient paganism and its imprint upon Christian society, rather than study modern paganism to begin with. And then when you've established yourself and you've got a secure job, you can start writing about the stuff you always wanted to write about all along. That's exactly what I did. And it preserved my career, which otherwise I just don't think I would have had.
Wow.
But it's still difficult. It may be easier in America, where there's a larger community of pagan studies than there is in Europe. But I've had a large number of research students at any one time. Since the century began, I've usually had around 25. And they formed a very good, self-supporting, mutually supporting community. But they still had problems. One of my students wanted to research into the influence of Aleister Crowley on British occultism after his death, which was a good subject. It hadn't been much looked at, and it is significant. And he applied for a research grant from a big national funding authority, the one that funded most research students. And after he did so, I was telephoned by a member of the panel that awarded the funding to warn me that my student had done this and to warn me against him, saying from his application it was clear that he was mentally ill. And I wondered if I'd missed something, if this person was clinically trained, was actually identifying a syndrome or something that I hadn't seen. So I politely asked for her diagnosis. And it turned out that her entire evidence of his mental illness was that he wanted to work on the influence of Aleister Crowley. And she felt that anybody dealing with that topic had to be sick. And I disagreed with her. She rang off angrily, having told me that she'd warned me. And needless to say, he didn't get funding. He did then fund himself through his thesis and produced a perfectly good book.
Goodness. Yeah, okay. I don't even know what to say to that.
It doesn't get a lot worse than that.
No, that is pretty bad.
And from my own experience, I've had a lot of trouble in my own career. I've been very careful never to identify myself publicly as a pagan. I've never denied that I'm a pagan either. What I've always said when questioned is that my religious beliefs I have any are my own business. I left it at that. So publicly, all that I have ever done is research into modern pagans. And only since the mid-1990s when I felt secure and confident enough to do so. And I still had a lot of problems. The student newspaper ran an article saying I could be a witch and people should avoid me. My university froze my salary after that for 3 years as a punishment of me. And even after my book on the subject, Triumph of the Moon, came out and my salary was restored to increments again, and people were generally pleased with me. When a prominent American scholar went to Cambridge, our premier university, and one which I had attended as a student, and asked what I was doing now, the Cambridge historians told him he could forget about me, because I'd gone mad, become a witch, and left the profession.
Oh.
No wonder I didn't get invitations to speak at conferences, didn't get any good research for years. I had to rebuild my career after that book. I did it properly, but even I didn't get away undamaged.
And it was such a stunning piece of work. I mean, I still refer to it regularly.
Oh, it's outdated. I've updated it recently. It has its faults, but it was a pioneering work,
Right.
both in good and bad ways.
This is a dilemma that I've often raised in discussions with my interfaith colleagues and friends. I don't know if you're aware that been very active in interfaith work on the board of our state organization here for a number of years. And a number of them are academics. And they, of course, are curious about what kind of institution Cherry Hill Seminary is. But one thing we've discussed is this idea of going native. You know, that anthropology is still haunted by claims against people like, oh, I'm sorry. Well, at any rate, by accusations that somebody is less objective if they seem to sympathize with something. Meanwhile, for example, my entire Department of Religion here at the university are all Christian scholars and occasionally a Jewish scholar, and they only brought in an African-American female chair some years ago. And their numbers, of course, are dwindling. There's talk of folding them into the English department, which is really sad. But the idea that if you are not part of a mainstream religion, your opinion doesn't, and your research doesn't count. But if you are, it doesn't matter that you're researching the same topic of which you are a part, that you're engaged in. Very frustrating.
You've precisely identified the problem. In theology and religious studies, traditionally, it's regarded as a real asset to research if somebody is a member of that belief community that's being researched. And it was outsiders who chose to write about established religions that were not their own and in which they did not believe, who were regarded as troublemakers and as being disadvantaged intellectually. So there was a complete double standard, a somersault, when the accusation of going native as being falling off from high academic standards only got applied to religions of whom the majority disapproved.
Yeah.
And likewise, anthropologists evolve a taboo against going native as part of an imperialist hangover of disdain for and contempt for and alienation from indigenous peoples.
Well said.
I think that from my own experience, once again, the healthiest situation is variety. I think it's good to have any historic or present community researched to a high scholarly standard, both by people who are insiders and those who are not.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to something you said earlier, you said people should pursue what they love, and that you have been able to do that within a particular structure. But what do you really love? What do you love about your work? What's been your favorite project?
All of my projects are rewarding and engrossing. I don't engage in a project unless I find it exciting. My only doldrum was that I founded my career quite easily and successfully on mainstream old-fashioned British political and military history, specifically that of the English Civil War and Revolution. And I really enjoyed doing that. But I then went on to write political history of the later 17th century of the restored monarchy. And I was very much encouraged to do that for my career by people whose views I respected. But I just found myself disliking politicians. And I found myself disliking British society whenever it wasn't severely dysfunctional, as in the Civil War. And when I turned to writing about ancient paganism instead, which I always loved, as an experiment, it was as though my youth had returned. It was a second spring to me. I was happy again. And I learned that lesson. And ever since then, I've alternated the types of history I've written so that I never feel I'm getting bogged down or burned out in any one of them. But given this system, I'm incredibly fortunate in that research and writing are such beloved pastimes of mine. In other words, when I engage in either, I feel the same bliss that a lot of people do when engaging in beloved recreations, research and authorship, especially writing, creative writing, the writing of books, of articles. is equivalent to cricket or yoga or basket weaving for other people. I relax, my cares drop away, I enter another world, an enchanted world, and I'm perfectly happy. And this is a great contrast with a lot of my colleagues, people who write superlative scholarship, which I admire dearly, but hate every minute of the process. They're very glad of the result and the quite justified respect and admiration that they're given. But they find the actual process of the research and writing laborious and nerve-wracking and hate every minute. They write as well as I do, or better, but I don't have any of that problem. So I feel very blessed.
That is a blessing. I have a similar reaction when I began to study hieroglyphs, I guess 8 or 10 years ago. Yeah, I just find myself getting relaxed and I'm really focused. And so I do it to relax when I'm stressed out. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
So what do you love? What are you looking forward to? Oh, and I don't want me to forget to ask you about your most recent book. Because I know that's just an issue.
That's called Queens of the Wild, which is a great title. It's not mine, it was chosen by my publisher because we couldn't find a catchy and attractive title that actually reflected what the book was about. And that one was the closest. What the book is about is challenging our traditional view of pagan survival by drawing attention to quite a number of important figures, all of them from the divine or superhuman feminine, in Christian society of the Middle Ages and early modern period, who definitely aren't Christian. They have nothing Christian about them whatsoever, but neither are they clearly survivals from the pagan ancient world. They seem to have been developed, to have appeared and spread in a Christian society while not being Christian. And so I think that the old polarized terminology of pagan and Christian is not really adequate to figures like that. Medieval, early modern European society was a lot more complicated than we thought it to be. And that's the argument of the book. It was huge fun to write. It was my COVID book. I wrote the whole thing. I had lockdown in Britain, and it kept me sane and happy in those circumstances.
Well, that's fortuitous. The cover is very cheerful, I have to say. It's very inviting.
I'm glad you like it.
I'm looking forward to reading it soon. So what are you going to do next?
Well, something that pagan readers will not know and need not know is that I alternate my subjects, as I've just said, to keep fresh. And so I alternate a pagan-friendly book with a book on conventional British mainstream history. And so in between The Witch and Queens of the Wild, I wrote a study of the young Oliver Cromwell, which revised the view of him that got established in the 19th century for the first time. And I tried that as an experiment. It had been panned, I'd have fled, but it got praised a lot. And I was encouraged to go on and study the next in Cromwell's life and produce a 3-volume biography of the whole man. And so I'm just writing up the 2nd volume of Cromwell at the moment, taking him through the middle years of his career. And then I'm going to write a book on goddesses of love and death, or sex and violence, if you prefer. A string of very powerful divine female figures from Mesopotamia to Ireland and Scandinavia. We're talking about Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus, the Morrigan, and Freya, and Hathor in Egypt, who all, to some degree, link being love goddesses with being war goddesses in a very intimate way. And some of them are actually a chain reaction. So Inanna became Ishtar. Ishtar influenced the development of Astarte. Astarte helped give birth to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite morphed partly into Venus. So you can see a kind of divine domino effect across ancient history, and I'm going to be writing about that.
Egypt is a good place to look at that because they were in existence for so long, and a lot of the classical Greco-Roman writers visited there and would say, "Oh yes, we know who Jehuti is. We call him Thoth or Hermes." Yeah.
Yeah, and they've got 3,500 years of continuous dynamic development. So early Hathor begins as not just the kind of milk-giving, loving goddess, but actually terrifyingly destructive and violent as well. And then her destructive aspect gets split off into Sekmet.
Yes.
So you can see the development of goddesses there. And it is this process of the life history of goddesses which I'm interested in writing.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I look forward to that too. So is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners today?
I think I've shared it all. I've packaged under the questions you've put to me everything that I really wanted to say.
Well, in that case, I'm going to pause the recording. So I just had one question. I didn't recall you're having a sister. What happened?
Yes. Yeah, I mentioned her at the beginning, didn't I, when I said my mother was pregnant with her. I should have slipped that in. It was part of the whole disaster, but my mother miscarried her with the shock of my father's death. So I grew up with no father and no brother or sister. Either. Just mum and me.
Well, I appreciate your sharing those details about your life. I think that gives more depth to our perception of you as a scholar and friend to the pagan community.
That's right. I've taken my courage in both hands here and told Cherry Hill stuff I haven't told about myself to anybody else.
Well, for that we're grateful. And you know what? I hope this self-exposure, self-disclosure will be good for your future in some way.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again. I want to thank everybody who's here today, and I'll close in just a minute. So that was the pre-recorded interview that we did, and it was just so much fun. I love talking to this guy, but I know that the chat line has been busy, and so I want to, let's see if I can find you again, Margot, and get you on screen here to help facilitate some conversation. Whoop.
I'm right here.
Yeah, I'm trying to, are other people seeing Margot on the screen with me? Maybe not. Let's see.
Not yet. Oh, yep. Some people are seeing me, some are not.
Okay. Well, I'll put myself in a gallery view. There we go. All right. So what have you got for us, Margot?
Let's see. I've got an interesting comment that, let me pull this back up. Maureen mentioned, the discrimination issue, definitely, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. And she said the emphasis on DEI here in the United States could work to our advantage, or work to the advantage of the pagan scholar. Claims of any kind of discrimination, and basically, this concept of trying to use that mantle as a way to address the issues of taking pagan scholars seriously and establishing legitimacy. So I just thought I would open that up to comments if you want.
And I will say, Ronald had talked to me about this when he was here in 2013. And that was a very painful period for him. I think he was still in that period where his salary had been frozen. So I think we can't dismiss the risks, and we have to be realistic about what's our tolerance for what we're willing to sacrifice for our truth, so to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't find the icon for raising my hand, so I'm now raising my hand.
Thank you, Maureen.
Go ahead.
Yes.
I just finished a doctoral program at Arkansas State University in December. So for the last 4 years, I've been in the academic environment. And interestingly, in that context, I found no resistance to writing on themes in paganism. I could have done my dissertation on a theme in paganism. As a matter of fact, I started to. And then I changed my mind because I thought something from a literary field would be more broadly understandable. But I think something might be changing. That's my point. I think something might be changing, at least in the department I was in, which of course is not representative of everything. I know that. But miraculously, I ran into absolutely no resistance whatsoever. The department that I'm in accommodates folklore, history, it's called heritage studies. So there was a different kind of a different attitude. It wasn't exclusively the established history point of view that Dr. Hutton was talking about. And of course, it's United States too, which is the difference in environments between the US to Britain, which is, much more conservative and traditional than we are. But somehow something might be changing. And personally, I think it's the result of this constant focus on DEI. Academia says to itself over and over again that there can be no discrimination based on these minority points of view. So it's just one more like that, when it comes up, it's just one more.
Ellen, you have your hand up. Oh, we got you on mute. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? There you go.
So sorry. The song Unmute, which we're all singing during the pandemic. Maureen, I'm glad to hear that, but I would say that it may be different for people who are trying to get a career in academia. And of course, I'm older and I come from another era in terms of getting positions. And so I'll put that out there. But it seems to me that even now, that people who specialize, do their dissertations on pagan issues, without it being paganism and something else, have difficulty finding positions. And so it's not discrimination in the direct sense. It's more, what does somebody want to hire somebody in? Is it I'm a sociologist, is it sociology of religion or anthropology of or sociology of the family? There are many more jobs in the family. There are many more jobs in criminology. Just looking at that, it makes it very difficult for people who do their dissertations about paganism to be able to then get a job. Just a thought that it's not direct discrimination as there had been. I remember when there was very direct discrimination against pagans, in which there were lawsuits to have children taken away from mothers because they were witches, etc. I'm not seeing that much now, but.
Well, you're absolutely right when it comes to applying for jobs. You can look at job descriptions and see immediately that most university history departments or English departments or whatever hire in much broader territory, much broader time period, and much broader thematic material. So right, That's why I didn't do my dissertation on that. I did my dissertation on the novels of the Mississippi River Delta, which is, more broadly applicable in the field of literature. So, but
That's much
as far as
broader. And
as
I
far as
studied-
being a student, I encountered absolutely no resistance to the topic. As a matter of fact, the faculty members in the department that I was in, and again, that's Heritage Studies at Arkansas State University, and they're unique, I know, they were actually interested from a folkloric perspective. So they were more than tolerant. They were actually supportive. They actually also, a couple of them tried to convince me to go ahead with the dissertation topic in the paganism area because they knew I was passionate about it. So at the student level, I didn't run into anything, but exactly what you're talking about. I was looking at job descriptions and I could see this is not going to fit up. So that's why I didn't do it.
And that disturbs me because your professors should have been, that disturbs me greatly because your professors should have been looking out for you in terms of your
It would have
becoming employed. And the fact that they just said, oh, go for it. And then cheekers, we're really sorry that you're only a contingent employee. It doesn't make me feel happy. It
No,
doesn't make me feel they were really doing their job. And
you can make that argument, but fortunately, I was looking out for myself. I realized it, and I went the route that I did, so I came out okay. But just in I think they do deserve credit for at least in the academic environment, allowing people. Listen, I should also tell you that I detected in this same department, and there wasn't any detection involved. All you need to do is just be there and be alive. There's tremendous tolerance and support for all kinds of minority points of view, racial, orientational, everything, and they make a big point of that. It's like something that they're very proud of. So,
Maureen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ellen, I wonder if you have any other advice for, since you're here. Thank you. Hello. Good to see
I
you.
came in late because I made an error, but I'd like to, since it's taped, I think I'll be able to hear the beginning.
Yeah, you will. I'll be posting it by tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there are a number of you in here who are scholars or people involved in
There
hiring.
are. I saw there's a number of people who all will have something to say, and probably more than I, because they're a little younger than I, so they were in the job market more recently. My general advice is, sure, go for studying paganism. We need young scholars, and there's so much to study, but put it in a larger context so that you're putting it in a context that will find a job in your field. And I would say you need to look at what the job postings are as you're planning your dissertation. Did I do this? No, I was totally uninformed and crazy. I had no idea, and no one protected me. So I was like everybody else. But I think as a faculty member, that is not responsible, that you should be protecting your students from their ignorance. That
still
many
think
of
it's a
them are
hoot.
ignorant, and that you need to protect them from their stupidity. I'll phrase it in that way, that they don't know, they don't have a clue. Look at what is going on in the job market. Where are the jobs? And try to do what you want, what interests you, but put it in a frame that means you could get a job teaching Sosa the family if that interests you at all, that you could get a job teaching Sosa organizations, for example. And I know my field better than literature, so I won't hazard a guess, but if you look at literature and there's jobs in the Delta or in the South, or poetry from a particular period, you may want to look at that in the way in which you can incorporate paganism with it. Doing one scholar that I knew who did get a job combined paganism with Chinese religious studies. Seems a little, but he was able to talk about spirituality, and that worked. And he was able to get a job because they were more interested in the Chinese. So I say, look at what you can get jobs in. I have not yet seen a call for scholars in paganism, maybe alternative religions within religious studies. That may be something, so you can put it within that, but within a larger context. Once you get tenure, then you could do the stuff purely on paganism.
I still think it's a
That's a good
hoot
point.
that your book, your first book on the pagan census, was published by the University of South Carolina. And
My first book was A Community of Witches, and it was also published by the University of South Carolina. And I had gotten a job my original work was historic, so I did something completely different. So it wasn't my dissertation, but I got that book published because the editor of the series on religious studies at University of South Carolina heard me give a paper at the SSSR.
Who
And
was
said,
that? Who was that? Was
that
it
was
Jim?
Fred Denny, and he gave a lot of young scholars a lift up by going to their sessions on things that he thought might be good for his series.
Mhm.
And he said he was at the University of Colorado at the main campus and in Boulder, and he went to these sessions, he went to those meetings, and he went to hear people who were not yet published in books and to encourage them to write it and send it to him. And, he came to hear mine. He said, met me for a cup of coffee afterwards and said, here's the stuff about the University of South Carolina. Think about making it a book, and I'm happy to work with you. And he did work with me. He really went out of his way. And he did that for a number of young scholars. There were a whole bunch of us. We all speak of him with great fondness as he came and found us.
Nice. Well, I'd like to ask some of the other scholars present. I know we've got a number of people in here who are in our master's programs, and everybody else counts too. But if you are able to write and put out your writing, I want you to think about how you have to do research and you're looking for sources for your own papers. So maybe it's important for you to get your papers out there too. Margot, do you want to say anything about that as our academic dean?
Yeah, I think it's something that's, can feel very intimidating at first. You're still in the program, you're not sure if your voice is relevant. And the point, it really is. It definitely is. It's just a matter of just taking that step and saying, where can I submit a paper? Where can I get some feedback? So we encourage that. And that's one of the things that we're working on, is trying to get some of those announcements out to our students so that they can see where they can submit. Laurel brought up just a very interesting point or question. I wonder if pagan scholars could develop a pagan perspective or theory. It's similar to queer theory or feminist theory, to look at things. And that would be a really interesting area of focus, I think. If there anyone else that has a perspective on that.
I don't see why it couldn't be done. I think that's a brilliant idea. Give it a theoretical foundation and you're on the map. Boom, like that.
Well, maybe that's something that our students can work on.
A number of our people presented at the Claremont Pagan Studies Conference a few weeks ago, which has been going on for something like 10 years now. And let's see, Mystic South has got a papers section at their conference in Atlanta in the summer. And we are talking about how we might incorporate paper presentations by our own, not just students, but faculty. So putting that bug in your ear.
And Helen just posted, I would encourage people in the MA programs to try and publish an article from one of their papers. Absolutely. You know, what's the worst they can do? Say no. You know, do the work. Try to see what you can get put out there, and maybe even present at different conferences. You'd be surprised.
Angela, I see your hand and then
Thanks.
Valerie, but I want to tell you, Helen, I got a note from a prominent, trendy academic journal a couple of years ago. My advisor and I submitted my research in which I cite you. And 7 minutes after my email went out, I got back a no and suggesting that I read the work of Helen Berger. And I thought, okay, I get the hint. You're not even interested. Anyway. So-
But that'll happen. You'll get
Yes.
that they're not interested, and then you try another journal. And
Right.
and sometimes they're interested and they send it out, and you at least get feedback from the reviewers. And once you dust off your hurt feelings, because they didn't just say you're brilliant,
Yeah.
you could then actually learn quite a lot from that. So it's not that your paper will necessarily get published, but if it does, it's a
Mhm.
wonderful feeling, and it's a wonderful thing, and it might get published. You might have something unique, and if not, it's something that'll give you insight.
Yes, thank you. Angela, I saw you a minute ago. Are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here. I got my PhD in 2008, and someone who was in the cohort year ahead of me did write her dissertation on pagan studies. Was it the Sheila Nagig and the female divine? Now, that's not to say that she's gone on to get placed in a great tenure position, but that was going on 20 years ago, and it wasn't. I mean, I hear that there's resistance to it now, but that wasn't always the case. I think that some of us are resistant to publishing from pagan perspectives because of the pushback that we get from one another, not necessarily the pushback that we get from outside, but because there are so many different kinds of paganism, and there is a lot of kind of infighting within the pagan community about who is okay to say what about what tradition. And I think that we feel like we kind of maybe don't want to isolate ourselves within our own community. It's just kind of a thought.
Thank you. Valerie, I think you had your hand up.
I'm glad we're talking about publishing. I was going to ask this. I'm still not formally matriculated at Cherry Hill, but I was wondering, with my academic background, I come from a place where there was a tremendous amount of professorial support for publishing. Like, you got a lot of feedback and support and direction. And I think that it would make a really big difference for me if I was thinking of publishing articles from papers I'd written, to know that there was sort of a continuity of that kind of support. Because at Cherry Hill, you just take a course from a professor, and then you take a course from another professor, and then you don't necessarily circle back to working closely with one professor in one really focused discipline. So if I were going to want to publish, which I do, I would want to be matched with not just an academic advisor, but an academic advisor who would be able to comment knowledgeably on my area of interest and like push me in the right direction and promote my interests, say, go here with those interests, someone who's really knowledgeable. That's what I would really request and need. I don't know if Cherry Hill has the capacity for that, but that's what I would desire.
Valerie, have you taken the research class yet?
No, I haven't taken
Okay.
it yet.
So that class will help a lot with that component, what you're talking about. But I saw in addition to that, it's something that we've been talking about, is having for lack of a better term, a thesis writing group, or a group where there's a little bit more support for the research and the writing after the class is over. So it is something that we are working on. because, and then we can expand that into, you know, not just a thesis, but any kind of research or you know, any kind of publishing that you're thinking of. So yes, we have that in the back of our heads that we're hoping to develop.
I'm also wondering, because I have, you know, relationships with past professors a little bit who are not necessarily involved day to day anymore with Cherry Hill, but just the general feeling of like, what's the goodwill out there for toward Cherry Hill students by professors who are not necessarily teaching regularly? Like, boy, it would be a dream to be kind of paired in correspondence with, you know, somebody like Michael York or Ronald Hutton or Helen Berger. You know, that would be fantastic. That would make a lot of difference.
And I want to tell you, as an MDiv graduate of ours of a few years ago, that I did feel that support. I understand that it's not the same as walking on a campus and being in a room with people. I think part of what we have to offer is that we are smaller. So when you're in a classroom, you're in a more intimate setting. But I reached out to people. In my case, it was Bob Patrick and Deirdre Rogers. And then an outside person, I intentionally went to a friend in the community who was a PhD legend. And because I wanted a different voice on my committee. And not only were they incredibly supportive, but they've continued to be, you know, to the point that Deirdre pushed me to submit that article that was rejected. And that was after my graduation. So I think you can reach out to most of our people and they'll be open to that kind of interchange. You know, I'm sure it's on an individual basis.
Thank you.
I know our librarian is a champ. She's on my screen right beside you. Dana Dirksen is fabulous. She's very supportive.
And I'm with Mongo. The worst thing anybody could say is, I'm sorry, I don't have time now, which is often the case, but that they're unlikely to send a hatchet man after you. So I think it's pretty safe.
Other questions before we start to wrap up, or comments? In that case, I want to really thank you all again. Our next, I'm going to put myself on the screen here. Well, I thought I did. Oh, well. Our next Coming to the Center is in the spring. I should have looked up the date before I got on here, but some of you are familiar with Joe Carson, who has been involved with Farah Faria. Anybody who has read Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon will know about Farah Faria, even though it's kind of an older and less known pagan tradition from the 60s. But it was an important influence on all of us. And when the founder and his wife both had passed, they left everything to Jo. So she has a whole collection of art and papers and lots of stuff. And she's actually developing a tarot set and book. I've seen some images from them that are just beautiful. So she'll be our guest in the spring. I think you'll enjoy that. Margot, do you have anything else you want to share?
The only other comment that popped up was Caroline was asking about an evaluation link.
For
is she still here? I just asked for an evaluation link.
For this, I don't have anything. I'm sorry. You're welcome.
Okay.
Please write us if you have feedback.
Absolutely.
And thank you for your patience with the tech. We're still learning, even all these years later. Zoom keeps getting better and better. All right. Thank you all.